Some people spend more time preparing to live than actually living. The problem is rarely life itself, it's the emotional weight attached to decisions, even small ones, which cafe to go to, what to order, whether to reply now or later, whether they sounded strange in that conversation, whether they should have phrased something differently. The decision itself is rarely the real problem. What terrifies you is the possibility of choosing wrong, then having to sit with that mistake, that you lacked judgment, maturity, self-awareness, something other people seem to possess naturally. And this is where overthinking takes over a person's life, through hesitation, through endless mental rehearsals, through attaching enormous weight to ordinary choices. This is Dose of Confidence, and today we're talking about overthinking. Let's break this down. There is a normal amount of thinking that belongs in decision-making. Of course, you should reflect before making choices. That's part of being responsible. You consider the consequences, you compare options. That's healthy. Overthinking begins at the point where thinking no longer creates clarity. Overthinking creates helplessness. That feeling of being unable to move because every option feels emotionally loaded. And what makes overthinking difficult to recognize is that it often disguises itself as intelligence. You tell yourself, I'm just being careful. I'm trying to make the right choice. I need to think about it a little more. Careful thinking eventually leads somewhere. Overthinking circles. You revisit the same decision repeatedly without gaining anything fundamentally new. Sometimes it's not because of the decision being so complex to require that much analysis. You are trying to remove the possibility of regret before acting, and that is impossible. No amount of thinking can create certainty, yet you unconsciously expect thought to provide exactly that. The truth is, most people overthink, usually in the areas that matter most to them. Relationships, career, money, identity, the future, how other people perceive them. Sometimes the overthinking becomes so normalized that you stop recognizing how excessive it has become. You may think that this level of internal pressure is simply adulthood, but there is a difference between caring about your life and living in constant negotiation with uncertainty. And what's interesting is that overthinking does not always appear around major decisions. Sometimes it appears around dinner plans, a text message, a social interaction, a purchase that barely matters, because overthinking is not really about the scale of the decision, it's about the emotional meaning attached to being wrong. That's why two people can face the exact same choice and yet experience completely different levels of distress. One person chooses and moves on, the other experiences the decision as a risk. And once decisions begin feeling threatening, the mind starts treating ordinary life like something that must be carefully managed at all times. A lot of overthinking comes from taking ourselves too seriously, not in an arrogant sense, but we begin treating every mistake as evidence about who we are. A bad decision stops being, I made the wrong choice, and it becomes, I should have known better. How did I let this happen? And once mistakes become personal in that way, overthinking intensifies naturally because now the mind is not simply trying to make good decisions, it's trying to avoid self-disappointment, trying to avoid shame, the humiliation of feeling foolish in hindsight. So we start expecting impossible things from ourselves. We want certainty before action, reassurance before experience, guarantees before movement. We want to get life right from the first attempt, the right career, the right city to live in, the right version of ourselves. And we refuse to leave room for trial and error, as though mistakes are proof of failure instead of part of being alive. That creates enormous pressure because now every decision carries the weight of self-worth. Overthinking becomes dangerous when it starts replacing action. Thinking in itself is not harmful, but excessive thinking delays life. If you hesitate constantly, not only with large decisions, but in ordinary things, you delay conversations, delay starting, delay trying, waiting to feel completely certain before moving forward. However, certainty never fully arrives, so the waiting continues, and over time, you can become trapped in a strange kind of stillness. Externally, you appear thoughtful. Internally, you are exhausted. because every decision feels loaded with consequences, large enough to justify that endless analysis. And ironically, the attempt to avoid mistakes often creates a much larger mistake. A life dominated by hesitation, a life where fear determines the scale of your experiences, where overthinking consumes the energy that should have gone into actual living. And one of the saddest parts is that overthinkers are usually highly self-aware. They often recognize the pattern while still feeling unable to stop, which creates another layer of frustration. Now they are not only trapped in indecision, they are disappointed in themselves for being trapped in it. Overthinking continues because it creates the illusion of control. You believe that if I think about this enough, I can protect myself from future pain. But life does not work that way. You can make the careful decision and still regret it later. You can choose thoughtfully and still feel dissatisfied afterwards. You can prepare fully and still feel uncertain afterwards, because uncertainty is part of life itself. And this is the contradiction at the center of overthinking. The more you try to eliminate uncertainty entirely, the more trapped you become. Overthinking promises complete relief. However, the relief overthinking provides is temporary, followed by another cycle of uncertainty, another interpretation, another possibility, another scenario the mind feels obligated to examine. Because the real issue was never a lack of analysis, it was the belief that certainty must exist before action. And once that belief begins collapsing, overthinking starts losing its hold on you. One of the most important realizations a person can have is this: very few decisions are as permanent as they feel in the moment. Even major choices can often be changed later. People change careers, move cities, start over again, rebuild entire lives. Yes, changing direction can be painful. It can cost time and energy, but most decisions are not life sentences. And recognizing this creates a breathing room, because then decisions no longer need to carry the pressure of permanent identity definition. You can try something, learn from it, and adjust later. That's how most people actually build lives, not through perfect planning, through movement, through experimentation, through mistakes, through discovering things in real time instead of trying to mentally simulate all possible futures beforehand. And strangely, people often become more decisive once they stop demanding perfection from themselves, because the fear decreases, not just the fear of making mistakes, the fear of imperfection itself. To stop overthinking, you first have to recognize what the mind is trying to accomplish. It's trying to create certainty, trying to eliminate regret before it happens, trying to protect identity through perfect decision-making. Once you see that clearly, the cycle becomes easier to interrupt, because now you understand. The goal is not to think or choose perfectly. The goal is to stop treating every decision as catastrophic. You begin asking different questions. Instead of, how do I guarantee this is correct? The question becomes, why does being wrong feel so unbearable? That changes your thought process, because now the focus is no longer endless analysis. It becomes emotional tolerance. Learning how to survive imperfect outcomes without collapsing into self-condemnation. And this is where hesitation slowly loses its grip. You make decisions more quickly. You recover from mistakes more easily. You stop rehearsing life so obsessively before living it. Uncertainty does not disappear. Yet, you stop demanding certainty before allowing yourself to live. Many people are postponing their lives until they feel certain enough to live them properly, certain enough to begin, certain enough to choose, certain enough to risk disappointment. And because that certainty never fully comes, their lives remain paused in anticipation, because life does not offer complete guarantees. And the more seriously we treat every decision, the more restricted our lives become. Overthinking is not always a sign of depth. Often it's a sign that mistakes have become intolerable, that being wrong feels too costly. Even though real life requires room for error, room for awkward decisions, wrong turns, unexpected changes, versions of yourself that eventually become outdated. That is how real life unfolds. And many people regain peace the moment they stop trying to make perfect decisions and start allowing themselves to be imperfect participants in life instead. If this video helped you, feel free to subscribe and share it with someone who might need it. And let me know what other topics you'd like to hear about next. You can find more related videos in the description if you want to continue exploring. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.